Welcome to Godless and Grounded. Throughout history, people have carried out some of the most shocking and unbelievable actions simply because they believed they were doing it for God. Human beings have fought wars, tortured one another, destroyed entire civilizations, sacrificed their own children, and even killed themselves, all while convinced they were serving a divine purpose. What makes these events even more mind-bending is that the people involved often thought of themselves as moral heroes, not villains. They were convinced that their cruelty or their strange rituals were not only acceptable but righteous because they believed God wanted it. Looking back, it is both fascinating and disturbing to see how far humans have gone when they believe that the highest authority in the universe was on their side. Take the Crusades as one of the most obvious examples. Starting in the 11th century, Christian leaders told people that God wanted them to march across Europe and conquer Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Thousands of knights, peasants, and even children took up the sword, convinced they were doing holy work. Popes promised that those who fought would have their sins forgiven. What followed was centuries of bloodshed. Villages were burned, people were massacred, and unimaginable cruelty was unleashed. When Jerusalem was captured in 1099, it is said that the streets ran red with blood because crusaders slaughtered Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians indiscriminately. The same God who supposedly preached love and peace was now the justification for some of the worst violence the world had seen at that point. Imagine how powerful the promise of divine approval must have been for people to leave their homes and commit such acts without questioning whether they were right or wrong. But violence in God's name is not only about wars between different religions. Sometimes it happens within the same faith. During the Inquisition in Europe, religious courts were set up to root out heresy. People were accused of not believing the right way, of doubting church authority, or of secretly practicing other religions. The punishments were terrifying. Torture devices were used to force confessions. People were burned alive at the stake because the church said their souls needed purification through fire. All of this was justified by saying it was for God. Instead of asking why an all-powerful God would need humans to torture each other, people accepted that cruelty was sacred duty. They believed saving souls required destroying bodies. It is one of the strangest contradictions in history, and it shows just how twisted morality can become when filtered through the lens of religious authority. We also find bizarre practices in smaller groups and cults. In 1978, more than 900 people from the People's Temple, led by Jim Jones, died in what is often described as a mass suicide in Guyana. These were not unintelligent people. Many of them were educated, committed to social justice, and believed they were part of a spiritual community that cared for the poor. But when their leader told them that God required their ultimate sacrifice, they drank poison willingly. Parents even gave it to their children. The phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid," comes from this event. It is chilling proof of how the belief that one speaks for God can push entire groups to commit acts that seem unthinkable to outsiders. Fear of divine punishment and trust in a supposed messenger of God silenced critical thinking to the point where death seemed preferable to disobedience. And this is not limited to Christianity. In ancient times, many cultures practiced human sacrifice because they believed it pleased the gods. The Aztecs in Mesoamerica performed large-scale sacrifices in their temples, cutting out the hearts of prisoners or even volunteers to feed the sun god. They believed the survival of the world depended on blood offerings. To modern minds, this seems horrifying, but to them, it was sacred duty. Parents in some cultures offered their own children, believing the gods would reward them with good harvests or victory in war. When people think they are acting for God or gods, the normal moral instincts of compassion and empathy can be overridden by fear of divine wrath or desire for divine favor. Even in recent times, we see strange and violent actions done in God's name. Suicide bombers in different parts of the world blow themselves up, convinced that they will enter paradise. They believe God wants them to kill enemies, and they are promised eternal rewards for doing so. To outsiders, it looks like senseless violence, but to the bomber, it feels like the highest form of devotion. It is terrifying to realize how religious certainty can make a young man or woman strap explosives to their body and walk into a crowd without hesitation. The power of belief transforms something everyone else considers insane into an act of supposed glory. But not all crazy things done for God are violent. Some are simply bizarre or self-destructive. Throughout history, certain groups practiced extreme asceticism, believing that hurting their bodies would bring them closer to God. People would whip themselves until their backs were raw. Others lived on top of poles for years, refusing to come down because they believed isolation would purify their souls. Some saints refused to wash or eat properly, thinking that suffering would please God more than living a normal, healthy life. These behaviors may look insane, but for centuries they were respected as signs of holiness. It shows how ideas about God can completely reverse the way people think about health, comfort, and happiness. There are also examples where people believed God wanted them to avoid modern medicine. In some communities, parents refused life-saving treatment for their sick children because they thought prayer alone was enough. Children have died from treatable illnesses like diabetes and pneumonia because their parents were told by religious leaders that seeking medical help was a lack of faith. Imagine being so convinced that God is testing your trust that you allow your child to die rather than taking them to a doctor. These parents were not cruel in their own minds. They believed they were obeying a divine command, but the outcome was tragedy that could have been prevented with a simple hospital visit. Consider also the witch hunts of Europe and America. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of being witches and working with the devil. They were tortured and executed in the name of protecting society for God. Strange tests were used, such as throwing a woman into water to see if she floated or burned. If she sank, she was innocent but dead. If she floated, she was guilty and executed. People were so convinced that God's world was under attack by hidden witches that logic and fairness disappeared completely. Fear mixed with religion created one of the darkest periods of irrational violence in human history. What makes it even more unbelievable is that many of the accusers saw themselves as righteous defenders of God's kingdom, while committing acts that we now see as cruel and absurd. History also gives us stories of rulers who declared themselves chosen by God and demanded absolute loyalty. Kings claimed divine right to rule, saying they were God's representatives on earth. Questioning them was not only treason but sin. This allowed them to wage wars, raise taxes, and silence critics, all with the excuse that God had given them power. Ordinary people suffered under this system, yet many accepted it because resisting a king meant resisting God. Even today, some political leaders claim God supports them in order to justify policies or wars. When people believe their authority is backed by the highest power imaginable, it becomes nearly impossible to challenge them. This blind obedience has allowed countless injustices to continue unchallenged. Another strange thing done in God's name is the destruction of knowledge. Throughout history, books have been burned because religious authorities declared them heretical. Scientific discoveries were suppressed because they contradicted Scripture. Galileo was threatened for suggesting that the Earth orbits the Sun because it challenged religious teaching. For centuries, entire societies were kept in ignorance because leaders said God's truth was more important than human curiosity. The crazy part is that this censorship was celebrated as devotion. People believed that protecting God's honor required silencing ideas and destroying human achievements. In reality, it slowed progress for generations. Even rituals around death sometimes became extreme in the name of God. In India, the practice of sati required widows to throw themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. This was seen as an act of devotion to gods and family. Though outlawed today, it was once honored as the highest form of sacrifice. Imagine the pressure on women who were told that burning alive was their spiritual duty. Without the belief in divine approval, such a practice would never have survived for centuries. It shows again how faith in God can override basic instincts for survival and compassion. And there are countless smaller examples too. People refusing blood transfusions because of religious teachings. Communities destroying statues or art because they believe images offend God. Parents disowning children for leaving the faith because they think God commands them to cut ties. Leaders banning music, dancing, or even laughter because they say God disapproves. Each of these may seem minor compared to wars and massacres, but they are still crazy when you think about how much joy, freedom, and human connection is lost because of invisible rules claimed to come from a divine source. When we look at these events and practices from a distance, one question keeps coming up. Why do people believe that harming themselves or others is acceptable if it is said to be for God? Part of the answer lies in fear. Fear of punishment after death can be so overwhelming that people accept terrible suffering in this life. If someone is convinced that God will reward obedience with eternal paradise or punish disobedience with eternal torment, then even the most irrational and cruel actions can seem reasonable. Fear changes the way people calculate consequences. Saving your soul for eternity becomes more important than saving your body or even your child's life right now. Another part of the answer lies in authority. When leaders claim to speak for God, their words carry extraordinary weight. If a king, priest, prophet, or preacher says that God has commanded something, many followers will obey without question. To doubt the leader is to doubt God. That is why cults, extremist groups, and even entire empires have been able to convince people to kill, sacrifice, or suffer in bizarre ways. The authority of divine command makes critical thinking seem dangerous. Once someone accepts that God is on the side of their leader, almost any demand can be justified. But we should also consider the role of community. People do not usually act alone in these cases. They are part of groups that reinforce the belief that they are serving God. When everyone around you agrees that burning a witch or going on a holy war is right, it becomes very hard to see it as wrong. Social pressure combined with religious belief creates a powerful force. It can feel not only dangerous but almost unthinkable to stand against the group. Many of the craziest acts in history were done not by isolated individuals but by entire communities marching together in the same direction, all convinced they were righteous. In more recent centuries, we also see people refusing to adapt to basic scientific realities because they thought it offended God. During outbreaks of plague or disease, some communities refused quarantine or medical care, choosing instead to gather for mass prayer. This often spread the illness faster, killing more people. They believed that only God could stop disease, so practical health measures were ignored. Even today, during pandemics, we still see groups refusing vaccines or medicine because they claim faith alone is enough. The result is unnecessary suffering and death, all because people are convinced that relying on human knowledge is somehow a lack of trust in God. Another shocking example comes from religiously motivated wars outside of Europe. In Africa during the late 19th and early 20th century, the so-called Maji rebellion against German colonial forces was fueled by a religious belief that a special water blessed by God would protect fighters from bullets. Thousands believed this and marched into battle thinking they were invincible. The German guns cut them down mercilessly. The belief that God had provided magical protection led to the deaths of tens of thousands. What makes this tragic is that the people were fighting against real oppression, but the belief in divine protection blinded them to reality and turned their resistance into mass slaughter. We can also think about the self-proclaimed prophets who tell people to give up everything in God's name. Throughout history, individuals have declared that God told them the world would end on a specific date. Followers often sold their property, abandoned their families, or gathered in isolated places to wait for the end. Of course, the predicted date always passed without incident. Yet even then, many followers continued to believe, convinced that God had simply changed the plan. This pattern shows how strong belief in God's command can be. People sacrifice their entire lives based on promises that never come true, and still they remain loyal to the idea that God was speaking through a human leader. In some cultures, religious belief even shaped the way people treated their bodies after death. Ancient Egyptians spent enormous resources building tombs and pyramids because they believed the gods required elaborate preparation for the afterlife. Entire populations labored for years to build monuments for pharaohs who claimed divine status. While these structures are admired today as wonders of the world, they also represent one of the most extreme ways humans have organized society around belief in God. Imagine how much energy, time, and human suffering went into creating these tombs, all because rulers convinced people it was necessary for divine reasons. Consider also the concept of martyrdom. Many religions glorify those who die for their faith as heroes. While it may sound noble to some, it has often encouraged people to seek death rather than life. Throughout history, individuals have refused to compromise on minor religious rules even when it cost them their lives. Others actively sought opportunities to be executed so they could be honored as martyrs. In some cases, martyrdom has been used to encourage young people to die in wars or terrorist attacks. The idea that dying for God is the highest honor has led to countless tragedies. It flips the natural desire to live into a desire to die, which is one of the strangest psychological effects of religious belief. There are also disturbing examples involving sexuality and gender. In some societies, people have been mutilated or forced into harmful practices because leaders claimed God required it. Genital mutilation in different cultures has been justified as a way to please God or to control sexual behavior. Women have been forced to cover their bodies completely or live in isolation because religious authorities said God demanded modesty. Men have been told they must prove their loyalty by undergoing painful rituals. These practices continue in parts of the world today and are still defended as divine requirements. The strange part is that instead of being recognized as violations of human rights, they are celebrated as religious devotion. Another example that shocks many people today is the use of religion to justify colonization. European powers claimed they had the right to conquer distant lands because they were bringing God's truth to so-called heathens. This idea, known as the doctrine of discovery, gave them the belief that God had given them the right to take land from indigenous peoples. Missionaries often came alongside soldiers, preaching salvation while entire cultures were destroyed. For the conquerors, spreading God's message justified enslaving people, seizing land, and erasing traditions. Once again, we see how acting in God's name allowed people to commit acts that, without the religious justification, would be seen as robbery and murder. Sometimes the strangest acts are the most personal. There are stories of individuals cutting off parts of their bodies because they believed it would please God. Some monks castrated themselves to avoid sexual temptation. Others starved themselves nearly to death in the name of purity. To modern minds, this seems almost unbelievable, but within their religious worldview, it made sense. If God values purity more than life itself, then destroying the body becomes a way to honor God. This shows just how far people can go when convinced that the human body is worthless compared to the soul. Another bizarre example is the way some religious movements have tried to control knowledge of the future. People have trusted prophets, astrologers, and religious texts to predict events, often making life-changing decisions based on these claims. Wars have been started, marriages arranged, and entire economies shaped by belief that God was revealing hidden truths. When predictions failed, people often blamed themselves rather than questioning the authority. The strange devotion to false prophecies has led people to give away fortunes, abandon their families, or even commit mass suicide, all while convinced they were obeying God. What all these examples have in common is that they show how belief in divine authority can override basic human instincts of compassion, reason, and survival. When people are told that God commands something, it becomes more powerful than any personal doubt or moral hesitation. A mother can let her child die. A father can march his son into battle. A leader can order mass slaughter. And all of them believe they are doing something holy. This is not because they are naturally cruel, but because they have been convinced that pleasing God is the highest priority. That idea has led to some of the most astonishing and disturbing events in human history. Perhaps the craziest part of all is how these patterns continue even in the modern world. We live in an age of science, communication, and global awareness, yet we still see people killing, sacrificing, and suffering in the name of God. From suicide bombings to cult suicides, from religious wars to bans on medicine, the same ideas repeat themselves. It shows that as long as people believe divine authority overrides human reason, strange and destructive acts will continue. The costumes and rituals may change, but the underlying psychology remains the same. So when we ask what are the craziest things people have done in God's name, the answer is not a short list. It is a long catalog of wars, sacrifices, tortures, suicides, and bizarre rituals that stretch across centuries and continents. Each of these actions may look different, but they all come from the same source, the belief that God's will must be obeyed at any cost. And as long as that belief continues, human beings will keep finding new and strange ways to harm themselves and others in the name of the divine.